Okay, well, we're 1 minute past 3, so those who are joining us a little late can join as the session goes on, but let's get started for those who've joined us promptly on time. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Sarah Corley. I'm DFI's community lead for those of you that don't know me, but I know quite a few of you. I recognize the names joining the webinar, so it's lovely to see some familiar people joining us today. I'm really happy to share with you that we've got an amazing guest speaker today. Emma Lindley, and Emma is the co-founder of Women in Identity, and she's going to talk to us today about the role of bias and culture and all sorts of different things in identity. Emma's going to share more with you about what Women in Identity do, and also about how they can help you and you can help them. So I'm not going to tell you too much more because I'm stealing Emma's thunder, so I'm going to hand directly over to Emma to tell us more. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to talk probably for the next 35 minutes, and then I'm going to open up for kind of questions. First of all, I want to say thank you to DFI today to give us the opportunity really just to talk to you all about some of the work that we've been doing within Women in Identity. And Women in Identity has been around, we're a not-for-profit, global not-for-profit. And we've been around probably for around 3 years now, but formally for around the last 12 months. And I'll talk a little bit towards the end of this presentation about what Women in Identity are and our vision and our mission. Just in terms of my background, I have been working in the identity space for quite a long time now, so since 2002 actually, so almost 20 years. And some of the products that I worked on back in 2002, interestingly enough, were actually built on CD-ROMs, which if anyone still remembers a CD-ROM. And obviously identity has changed a huge amount since then. I've worked in some really small startup companies. I've also worked in some big companies as well. I was, my last sort of large role was, I was head of identity and risk for Visa. So I've kind of seen identity from lots of different angles. I've got a kind of a product and strategy and business development background. I wouldn't consider myself a technologist, although, 20 years working in identity, you have to understand technology to an extent. So today I'm going to talk about bias and blind spots and bad identity systems. So what is bias? Well, bias essentially is a prejudice, a strong inclination of the mind or a preconceived opinion about something or someone. And it can be favourable. We often think about bias as being unfavourable, but it can be favourable. But essentially it can be something that's, gives you the mind to be for or against an idea. And bias, interestingly, is really important from a human perspective. Again, we often think about bias as being quite a negative thing, but it is very important from a human perspective to have bias because it enables our brains to segment large amounts of information and compartmentalize it easily. So bias, it's something that has grown in mankind. It's something that, and interestingly, even they found elements of bias within monkeys and chimpanzees. So it's really important that bias is a human trait because it allows us to segment information. And there are huge amounts of types of bias. So this is a very complicated diagram, but there are lots and lots and lots of different types of bias. And those all affect the way in which we think about things and we compartmentalize that information. Again, as I said, bias is very important, but it can have negative consequences to the way that we think about things. So just a few types of bias, just to give you some examples. This is a thing that's called observer bias. So this was actually back in the 1960s in the UK. And this was a gentleman called Cyril Burt, and he was a psychologist known for his work on the hereditability of IQ. So essentially, Cyril Burt had this view, his own personal view, that he thought that families from low socioeconomic status, i.e. kind of working class children in the UK, were also likely to have lower intelligence compared to children that came from higher socioeconomic backgrounds and so slightly richer families. And so he alleged that a scientific approach to intelligence testing was revolutionary, and he allegedly proved that children from working classes in general were less intelligent. Now, his view on this was actually quite impactful. It had a huge impact in the way that the UK education system back in the 60s was then developed. It actually led to a two-tier educational system. And what happened was middle class and upper class, so richer children, were sent to better schools, and working class children were actually sent to worse schools. Now it's interesting because obviously that then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is just one element of how somebody's bias, their personal kind of view on something, can then have a huge impact. So this is sampling bias. This is something that, in kind of Western countries, particularly if we look at, technology, particularly that's developed in perhaps places like Silicon Valley, can have quite a negative effect. And I certainly see it, in the UK with some of the kind of perhaps technology startups where they don't have a particularly diverse background or range of people within their teams. And also the people that they test their technology on are not necessarily a good range and diverse range of people. And what happens is, if in sampling bias you take, a selection of people that you go, well, we think these are going to be perhaps, the representative of the users of our system, but they're not representative of the users of the systems. Obviously, in this, we're using the weird analogy, so it's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and demographic. What happens in the sampling bias is you end up potentially with products that only work for those types of people. So that's another issue. So here's another example, and this actually comes from Google. So, large companies have these issues with it as well. So back in 2014, Google had an issue because they found that when YouTube, obviously YouTube owned by Google, launched their video app for iOS, they found that when some of the videos were coming in, that the videos were being loaded, what they thought, upside down by users. And so they were like, this is really strange. We've got about 10% of people uploading their videos upside down. What it turned out, in fact, was when they had developed the technology, they had only actually tested it because everybody on the team that was developing the technology was right-handed. They had only actually tested the technology with right-handed people. So there is actually 10% of the global population are left-handed. So anybody that was left-handed, it meant that they were holding the phone in a different hand. And so the video then looked like it was getting uploaded upside down, but it wasn't. It was the fact that they actually hadn't tested the technology and tested the device to work with left-handed people. This is actually in their official blog, and they talk about some of the issues, and they talk about unconscious bias and how that then influenced them to develop a technology that then didn't work for that 10% of left-handed people particularly well. So here's another example of when bias is developed into a system. I'm going to actually just play this, and I'm going to talk over the top of it rather than have the volume up. So this is actually a soap dispenser. This is a soap dispenser that was, and this is a video that's widely used across the internet. You can search for this video, but this was actually, interestingly, in the Facebook toilets, the actual restrooms in Facebook. And this was a person that was trying to get soap out of the soap dispenser. And I'll just play this video so that you can see it. So there's a white hand there. He's getting soap out of the soap dispenser. Somebody here coming along with a black, dark-skinned hand and unable to get soap out of the soap dispenser. You can see there. And then they take a white piece of tissue paper. They place it underneath the soap dispenser, and it gives them some soap. So this just shows you that this soap dispenser clearly has not been tested with all the different range of skin tones that we have in the world. And this was actually in the Facebook offices in San Francisco. So that's obviously an issue. So, so just talked a little bit about bias and like generally how it can affect our thinking and how that then can develop into bad products being developed. You know, we've seen the example there with the soap dispenser. We also see the example there in terms of products for Google. So bias can have real implications in the way that we develop systems and products for people and technology for people. And we see some examples there. But what's the effect when we think about identity systems? Well, in my view, the effect of bias is even potentially more acute than in other technology systems, because when we think about identity, identity has the ability to it can become the gateway, positively or negatively, for people to be able to access services. So whether they can access financial services, whether they can access healthcare services like vaccines, whether they can access you know, their doctor, whether they can access the ability to be able to vote. So it has huge access positively or negatively, and the impact of bias within identity products really could be and can be quite acute. So I'm going to go on to talk about that now for a moment. So when we think about, you know, the inventions of things like username and password, we wonder really whether they were thinking about some of the types of users. You know, I have a 3.5-year-old son, and you know, I think about a username and password. You know, he can't even comprehend what a username and password is. You know, so how are we going to explain kind of usernames and passwords to children? And were the inventors of the username and password really thinking about children? Well, probably not at that point in time. They were just considering perhaps the people that were in their group or the people who were going to use the specific systems that they were thinking about. The other thing that we have to think about, you know, within, particularly within identity systems, is people with disabilities. You know, 17% of the global population have some kind of disability. And, you know, were people, when they were developing the username and password, were they thinking about people who have disabilities? Probably not. And that has a huge range of implications of how people with disabilities are able to access certain services, particularly if, again, as I say, if identity, and I'm just talking loosely about identity in terms of usernames and passwords now, is the gateway, positively or negatively, to allow people to access services. And then we think about, you know, relatives, perhaps the, you know, that you have or I have. You know, I think about my father and the challenges that he has with trying to, you know, usernames and passwords. Usernames and passwords to him are like the most complicated thing that he can possibly even think of. You know, my dad is in his 70s. You know, unfortunately, I'm his IT support, and that's a challenge for both of us. But you know, thinking about people of different ages and how they think about, you know, just simple login details like usernames and passwords, I'm sure that that's not what they were thinking about when they developed the username and password. And, you know, those types of things are getting more complicated now because we see the rise in things like fraud, the rise of things like password sharing, the rise of data breaches. And so now, as an identity community, we're moving on to using different types of, you know, authentication methods, but we're adding in another layer of complexity, which perhaps people may or may not understand. So I'm now going to talk through some examples, very clear examples of kind of where bias has affected identity systems and the negative effects that it has and can have. So this was an example from 2016, and this was a gentleman who was trying to upload his passport photograph to allow him, you know, to have his identity document. And the technology that was uploading the passport photograph kept on rejecting it because it said that he had closed eyes. Now, that obviously is because of his facial features, but it simply did not allow him to upload his photograph into his identity document and allow him to continue with that process, because essentially the technology didn't work for people. And this gentleman was Taiwanese, but he was living in Sydney. And he had been living in Sydney, I think, for about 2 or 3 years, and was unable then to get his passport document updated. So that was a real challenge for him, and that shows you what happens when we start to use technology that doesn't work for everybody in the context of identity. So I'm going to give you another example here. This is an example from the UK. And this is an example just from October of last year. This is where the Home Office in the UK have started to use a passport facial recognition check, and the headline actually says it fails to work with dark skin. Actually, the technology doesn't work for very light skin either. So if we think about, you know, the people at kind of both ends of perhaps the spectrum in terms of skin tone, it didn't work for very, very light skinned people or very, very dark skinned people. But what that meant is that when anybody with light skin or dark skin went to this particular technology application, they then couldn't get through the process. And this creates a really bad journey for the individual. It's bad on lots of different levels because they're unable to use the technology. They then have to go through a different route. And these are types of things that in the identity community, really, if we thought about it, we could fix. They don't actually have to be like this, you know, and this was just a case of the technology company in question not actually running enough photographs through the artificial intelligence to allow the artificial intelligence to be trained to see different types of skin tone. So we can see there the face detection software is normally trained on thousands of images, and one way bias can enter the system is if the training data isn't large enough or diverse enough to represent the group that it's being used on. So these are real world examples of where we see that the technology that is being built within the identity community actually isn't working for this huge range of people. And when we think about the types of people that identity technologies might need to work for, it's every type of human on the earth, you know, 7 billion people globally. And if we continue to develop technologies that have bias developed in them, then we are going to continue to disenfranchise and block out large swathes of the population. And the bias doesn't necessarily, I mean, I've given a couple of examples here in terms of AI. Again, you know, I'm not making kind of any comments on this, but, you know, we see in some of the national identity systems that have had challenges around bias and how they can actually end up excluding people. So if we look at, this is an example from Kenya, but if we look at in India with the Aadhaar system only used biometrics. And some of the people in India, just as, you know, as anywhere else, didn't actually have all of the biometrics to allow them to enter into these biometric systems. So people that perhaps had no hands were unable to use the Aadhaar system. People that were blind were unable to use the Aadhaar system. And so when we think about those types of people, sometimes they are the people that are already have a number of challenges in terms of, you know, life and you know, interacting with systems. And if we as an identity community make that systemic bias worse, we're actually going to take people whose lives are, you know, if we take somebody that's blind, for example, they have a number of challenges in their life already, and we are going to take that person's life and actually make it worse for them. So that's why when I talk about identity and systemic bias and sort of unconscious bias being developed into identity systems, it makes the problem even more acute. It's an even worse problem than it would be if it was a system, you know, that might be slightly easier to use. And, you know, might not have such huge impactful consequences if we don't make it, you know, work the correct way. So really, I think what we've had is we've had this mantra that's come from, you know, Facebook over, you know, the last X amount of years, this kind of move fast and break things, where we develop technology really quickly and we just, you know, let's get it out there and try it out and see, you know, what people think. And I think we are in the technology community really reaching a point where we have to, particularly within identity, is not move fast and break things, because when we think about identity, particularly if we move fast and break things, we could potentially be having a really, really big impact on, negative impact on people's lives, as well as a positive impact. But we could be taking a cohort of people, like I say, people perhaps who are blind, who have other disabilities, you know, perhaps are in minority groups, and making their lives worse. So perhaps what we need to be is not so fast, and thinking a bit more about, you know, we think about agile development and agile ways of developing technology now. And I'm not saying we have to go back to, you know, perhaps more, you know, old world waterfall, but we do need to think a bit more about, you know, our perspective of bias within the technology world and how that really might impact the users that we are developing that technology for. And we really need to have empathy with the users that might be using our technology and think through, well, you know, perhaps the users are going to be using our technology are not the people that are sat in the room with us. You know, they are perhaps, we've got to think about who those users are further out, and then the impact positively or negatively that our technology could have on them, particularly around identity. So then the question really is, you know, who's responsible? Whose responsibility is it to make sure that the technology works for everybody? Now, in my view, it is everybody's responsibility. You know, technology providers, and this is, you know, part of the mantra for women in identity, is technology providers need to be responsible and need to be really thinking about their area of bias. You know, perhaps if you're in the, you know, banking community and finance community, you need to be thinking about how identity technologies are implemented within your own environment, and making sure that they are able to include, as you know, as many people as possible and everybody, and how you're going to build out those channels to allow people to come through. And equally, you know, governments play a huge part in that as well. But ultimately, what we don't want to do from a technology and perhaps you know, the private sector, like financial services, we don't want to just make it government's problem that they have to be the ones responsible for all those people that can't get through some of these systems. We know that having financial inclusion is really important. We know that having inclusion and the ability to be able to use systems is really important for GDP growth from an economic perspective. And so we all have a responsibility to think about how the systems can work for everybody, and identity really is a critical part of that. And so implementing systems that don't work for large cohorts of the population is not only bad for those people, but it's also bad from a GDP growth perspective. So it actually doesn't help anybody if the systems have systemic bias. So just in terms of thinking about what we can do about that, how we should be thinking differently, and some practical things that you can do when you go away from this talk today. I think the thing that I always say to people is, you know, when you think about your users, and I've got some, you know, some leaves here and they're all different, you know, humanity is incredibly diverse, and you know, the user who is going to be using your system probably doesn't look like you. They probably are not from a similar background to you. I mean, they might be, but you've got to assume they might not be. So when you're in your groups and thinking about, you know, implementing identity systems, whether that be implementing identity systems in the context of, you know, financial services, or whether you're, you know, involved in build, not be like you, might not look like you, they might not even be from the same country as you. And so, you know, they might not be the same age as you, they might not have the same ability as you do. And so I think, you know, I always kind of try to get people to think about the user not being like you. Because that's the first point of kind of bias, is we always kind of assume that users of systems are going to be like us. Well, surely everybody's going to be able to do this. One of the interesting facts that I always like to pull out, because people, I mean, I live in the UK and people go, well, everybody in the UK must be able to use technology. There are actually 11% of, so we have what, 68 million people that live in the UK. 11% of our population in the UK cannot even turn on a device. So they don't know how to use technology. And so I think there are lots of assumptions that can often be made, particularly by people who are building technology, that everybody knows how to use technology, and that isn't always the case. And that's not the case, you know, even in countries that, you know, emerging markets, in, you know, countries like the UK or the US, there are large cohorts of people that perhaps cannot use technology. So the user is often not like you. So that's the first thing. The other thing is really thinking about diversity and thinking about the diverse nature of your team. So this is a comment from somebody that is at Airbus. But some of the thinking, and there's lots and lots and lots of reports out there about diverse teams, and the more diverse teams that you have, actually you can think and innovate better than teams that look the same, are from the same background, perhaps are from, you know, same socioeconomic background, the same culture, the same country. So the more diverse, better, and build better products. And interestingly, teams that are very, very similar, you know, homogenous groups of people, they do think quicker, and they do come up with solutions quicker. But it's that whole thing about, you know, move fast and break things. But they don't actually necessarily consider all of the options when they're thinking about that problem. Because they don't have a diverse background. So one of the things that you can do is kind of think about diversity. And the other thing about having diverse teams is actually it's good from a revenue perspective. So there's, again, lots and lots of studies out there to say that diverse teams actually make better decisions. And they generate more revenue. So, you know, it says here that the study, and McKinsey have done these studies, and a whole bunch of other companies, but 19% more revenue. So companies that actually have more diverse teams do actually make more money, which is interesting as well. So it's good for business, it's good for developing better products, it's good for business, and it's good for, you know, problem solving. So what can you do today? I'm just going to run through a few slides, and then I'll talk a little bit about women in identity, and then we'll stop for questions. So I think the first thing to do, and this is a really tricky, hard thing to do, is to accept that you are biased. Everybody is biased. I'm biased. I have bias. You know, everybody I know has bias, and as I said, it's not a bad thing. It's a human thing. Anybody that's human is biased, and also accept that the teams that you're working in are biased as well. And as long as you kind of accept that point, because it is just a fact, it's not a criticism of anybody. You know, I'm not coming with any judgment. It's just a fact. But if you're human, you're biased. And if your teams you're working in, you know, you will come with your biases. So I'd say that's the first thing that you can do today. Next week, what can you do? Well, I think just think about identifying the intended and unintended users, perhaps of your systems, whether you're thinking about identity systems or whether perhaps you're thinking about financial services, who are the people that you think are going to use your system, and who are the people that might use your system that you didn't think were going to use your system. And those might be the people that you go, oh, actually, I've not thought about how we would build our systems and our technologies and our products and our solutions to work for those people. I think identify how diverse your team is, have a good look at your own team. How diverse is your team? And what does that mean? Because often teams are not necessarily so diverse, but it's not a bad thing as long as you accept that if you don't have a diverse team, then you are going to have more bias naturally, because your team perhaps look the same or sound the same, or are from the same culture or perhaps the same gender. And empower your team to speak about diversity with respect to the identity system. So really just empowering people within your business to start to bring diversity on the agenda, and also, potentially the systemic bias that we might have within our teams as well. We, particularly when we're thinking about product development, we need to start thinking about bias, and we need to start talking about bias. We ran a workshop in Amsterdam, actually, about 3 months, maybe a bit longer ago, 4 months ago. And we had a whole bunch of people who were product designers and developers from the identity community in that workshop. And what was interesting was when we asked the question of all those product designers and developers, we had about 40 people in the room, if any of them, when they were starting to develop one of their systems, one of their identity systems, if they ever thought about their perspective of bias before they started developing and thinking about their next development, their next identity product. And absolutely nobody in the room said yes. So, even just having that point in which you're developing products and thinking about products, just having that moment of looking around the room and going, okay, what's our perspective in this room? Because we are going to be thinking about how we're going to implement this system. And we in this room might not be representative of the people that are going to be using the system and affected by that system. The next thing that you can do in the next few months is really add diversity into the software development lifecycle. We call it diversity of women in identity. We call it diversity by design. So we hear the term privacy by design, security by design. We're coining the term diversity by design. So how are you going to make your products work for a diverse range of people? If you don't have diverse teams, you can develop focus groups which have more diverse representation, so that when you're doing your testing of your products, you can make sure that you're testing them on the people that are going to be using them. Partner with companies that do build for diversity. So if your product doesn't have a particular kind of widget within it that enables certain amounts of users to use it, you can partner with companies that do. Improve the diversity of your team, and become mindful when you bring a more diverse representation of people onto your team, that you need to kind of think about inclusion as well, and making them be included in that team. And then just in the next 6 months, what can you do? Measure the impacts of diversity in terms of hiring, measure changes to the software in terms of for diversity. So just actually measure some of the impacts that you've had, and measure the economic benefit for incorporating diversity measures. So are you actually building products that are being more successful? Are they working on more people? Does that mean that you're having more success with your products? If you're in financial services, does that mean that you're able to get more people through the identity layer so that you can then give them access to more financial services? So just starting to measure some of those things as well. So let me just talk to you a little bit about women in identity, just for a couple of minutes, and then we'll go on to questions. So Women in Identity, as I said, we're a not-for-profit organisation. We are run by volunteers. So I also have a day job as well as Women in Identity. We have people working across the globe on Women in Identity. all in a voluntary capacity. And our vision is that digital identity solutions built for everyone should be built by everyone. So really it's talking to that diversity of the teams that are building these products to help us build better products that work for everybody. And our mission is to inspire, elevate and support a more diverse workforce in the digital identity industry. So just in terms of the organisation, as I said, we've been formally as a non-profit organisation, we've been around for about a year. So we were running as a minimum viable product for about 2 years, and then we've been around for about a year. I'll talk you through, we have an advisory team. So that's a really broad range of people based all over the place, and we're always looking to bring more people onto our advisory team. Some of those people have an identity background, some of those people have a financial services background, some of those people have just a pure technology background, some of those people come from the kind of non-profit and NGO sort of space. So we have a real kind of broad range of people on our advisory team. We then have an executive team, of which I'm one of the directors. We have our leadership team, which is our kind of like a core group. So we have a kind of core group of directors and leadership team. And then because we see the fact that identity is completely cultural, the way that we grow internationally as a group is we have ambassadors. We have ambassadors in a number of countries, but by certainly, you know, not every country. So you'll see some glaring omissions and gaps on our map here. But as I say, we've only actually been really running as a proper not-for-profit for just less than a year. But what we do with our ambassadors is we find somebody within a particular country or a region who says, well, I really believe in the whole mantra around diversity and identity, and so we set them up with a whole set of tools. We set them up with, you know, PowerPoint presentations, the Women in Identity PowerPoint presentation. We'll set them up with access to our tools. All of this is completely free of charge. We don't charge anybody to become an ambassador, and they can grow from a grassroots perspective what they want women in identity to be within their particular region. Because we know that identity is completely cultural. You know, I live in the UK. I can't, you know, whilst I worked in identity for a long time and studied identity working in lots of different countries, I can't completely understand how it works in different countries. And so we see that growing from the ground up. So anybody can join Women in Identity. And when it's called Women in Identity, but we are championing all diversity. So you'll see I've not just talked about gender diversity, I'm talking about all diversity. So we are champions of all diversity whilst we call Women in Identity. To join up, you can just go to the website, which is www.womeninidentity.org. So that's the website address there. It's completely free to join Women in Identity. So completely free to join. And it's also, in terms of anybody wanting to become one of our global ambassadors, that also is free, and we give you all the tools to do that as well. And those are that's our hashtag and our Twitter account. And if anyone wants to email us, they can do. That's our email address. So thanks very much. That's the end of the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. That was really interesting. And I think it was great that you brought it to life with some examples, even though some of them, I guess, like there is a little bit shocking to see that how much these biases still exist, and they're still happening now, right now. And they're not from the 60s or the 50s, they're still happening in today's world.
Yeah, and being implemented into real world identity systems today. The thing in the UK with the passport system, that was implemented just last year in the UK, and it has a real impact on people's lives. And those people that, as I said, have got the darker skin than the lighter skinned, some of which, interestingly, are on our Women in Identity team based in the UK, and they're like, I can't use that system. I just can't use it, and so they have to find you know, a more difficult route, which is harder for them. And, you know, often when we think about digital systems, there are lots of incentives to use digital systems. You know, people might be able to get things that are cheaper, or they might be able to get, you know, different types of monetary incentives to use digital systems. And if we're making some people unable to use those systems just because they have a certain type of skin color, or, you know, they've got certain types of facial features, or they haven't got certain types of documentation, then we're just going to be making people's lives more difficult.
It is really interesting, like that whole, and you know, I've had a number of conversations in various topics, how, you know, yes, identity, you know, should be a gateway for many people to access even more, but actually, if you do it incorrectly, it becomes a barrier, not
exactly. Yeah.
And it often impacts the more vulnerable in our society, you know, as well.
Yeah,
we've got some questions that have started to come in, and the first one I'm going to ask you, because I know that you were just talking about this, but we had someone who commented that you don't have any ambassadors for Africa. So we're hoping that people on this call might want to, right?
We would love, I mean, we would love to have some ambassadors in Africa.
There's no unconscious bias there towards Africa.
Yeah, so I mean, we're just looking to grow it out, and so if there's anybody in this call that would you know, that, so interestingly, I mean, I was just saying to Sarah, we were hopefully going to be going to the ID for Africa conference this year. And obviously all of the conferences, as we know, are not really happening. Well, they're not happening, not that they're not really happening. So so we were hoping that we were going to be able to have a bit more of a presence there, and we had actually raised some money to fund some women to attend that conference from Africa, to go to the ID for Africa conference, but it hasn't happened. So if anybody on this call would like to be an ambassador, please feel free to kind of reach out to Sarah, or use the email address there and contact me.
And I'll share a copy of the recording, but by email, hopefully tomorrow. But I'll also share your email as well, Emma, so people can reach out easily and directly to you to put their hand up to take up one of those positions. So fingers crossed, we'll have some new faces appearing on future presentations.
Okay, cool.
So a couple of questions have come in, and I think people have raised Kenya, which I know has been something here in Africa we've talked about a lot when it comes to ID. So we have Natalie, who was commenting that concerns were raised because it wasn't clear around how the biometric data would be used and stored, and, you know, potentially continuing to replicate historical systems and you know, systematic bias. And then Abigail, who I know is from Kenya too, you know, like is asking, are there good examples of any government that's done this well, or good ID systems out there that don't have, or have less bias? I guess it's very hard to say don't have, because we don't always know what we don't know, but are there any good examples out there?
So, I mean, every country goes around about tackling identity in a completely different way, and like I was saying, it is all very contextual to often the political environment, and perhaps the regulatory environment that they're in, you know, whether there are any kind of privacy laws that are already in place, you know, how the infrastructure works. So there are lots and lots and lots of different things in play. There are some countries that have had very successful identity systems that are used by the majority of the population. So Sweden is one of those examples. So they have a thing called Bank ID. And interestingly, in Sweden, it was actually the banks that got together and decided to build a digital identity system rather than the government. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be the government that kind of comes up with a solution. But the Bank ID system was the banks that got together, and they've built a system, and pretty much everybody in Sweden uses it. You know, they have gone completely, well, majority digital in Sweden now, but again, it's not without its issues, because in Sweden, because they've had this Bank ID system, they've then been able to build things on top of it. So they've built lots of electronic payment methods, which has then meant that they've talked about going to a completely cashless society in Sweden. But then there's been backlash against that because lots of elderly people have said, well, I don't know how to, and it's brought up some of these issues. So I'm not going to say that any country has managed to make this work. You know, the bank ID system has worked for a lot of people there, but it still has its issues because it's saying everybody's going to be digital, and not everybody's going to be digital, you know. So I think that's the thing, is we have to, whenever we're building for what we call the happy path, we also have to build for the unhappy path, you know, the people that, you know, are going to have difficulty with some of these systems. And we have to think of routes in which they can get to the same services, but it not be so difficult for them, you know, not make it so hard for them to get to those services. There must be other routes in which people can reach those services.
And I guess it's a good example of unintended consequences, you know,
Yeah.
that when it was designed, it wasn't originally meant to lead to that. But I guess that's why we constantly have to review and adapt.
Yeah. And I think identity systems do exactly that. They have to be constantly, you know, adapted. And I think Sweden, probably by their own admission, that their system is a number of years old now, and they haven't really changed to you know, they've just built all these services on and gone, isn't this all going well? And so they've reached this point and gone, let's go cashless. And people went, oh no, you know, people still want to use cash, and you know, not everybody's using this digital identity system, and it tended to be the older generation. So we have to have systems that work for those people, and they might be analog systems, and that's okay, but we can't just leave them with nothing.
And I guess it's in particularly the elderly women, or you know, maybe young disabled, who are often people that are excluded from these systems due to just the biases in producing the technology.
Yeah, exactly. Or assumptions about, you know, who might have. So, for example, if you were thinking about an identity system that just worked with mobile phones, well, who in the household has the mobile phone? You know, if there's only one mobile phone for a household, who owns that mobile phone? You know, then you might have people in the household then that are excluded, because you know, we're making an assumption that everybody has a device, for example. And again that assumption model is around bias. We're just going to assume that everybody in the household has a mobile phone. They might do in some countries, but others they won't.
And that links really nicely actually to what Robert's point was in one of his questions, you know, that he's saying women often maybe don't have SIM cards registered in their names, in their spouses or the sons. And, you know, in particular, women's identity. And we even see it now. I mean, I recently got married and I didn't change my name to become Mrs. Rich. I kept my name to become just, you know, I've had it for 40 plus years. I didn't decide to change it. But these kind of like assumptions and cultural issues and expectations particularly affect women, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they certainly can. You know, it can in certain, you know, certain regions, certain countries can affect women disproportionately, and I think that it becomes even more important to have diverse representation on the teams that are building these systems. You know, it's very important to have gender diversity and all diversity when we're building identity systems, because we need to be thinking about who they're going to be working for. When we think about the global population and we think about gender, it's about a 50-50 split, male to female, you know. And I kind of go, you know, when people say, and people often use the term, well, they're minority groups, and I'm kind of like, I don't think women are a minority group. We're one of half the world's population. You know, minority
100% of the presenters today, right? You know.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, I don't like using that kind of term, because I'm kind of like it just it's often used, but then actually when you look at the percentages, that's not necessarily it. And you know, when we think about people with disabilities, that's 17% of the global population. That's actually a really big amount of people. You know, 17% of 7 billion people is a lot of people. And, you know, we have to be thinking about these people, otherwise we are going to end up just marginalizing people.
And Robert also asked a follow-up question around, so for the elderly or disabled, you know, where you talked about passwords and the, you know, I guess like the typing in and the memory of those, can technology such as voice or face recognition help, or does that also then add another layer of potential bias and complication?
I mean, I think technology can, technology is never the starting point. I'm always, you know, I've worked in technology for 20 years, but I'm always a very keen advocate of, you know, you have to look at the problem that you're trying to solve. And if technology is a way in which you can make that easier, then certainly, yes, use technology. I think, you know, so just thinking about facial recognition systems, and perhaps biometrics and voice recognition systems, I think they are fantastic tools when used in the right context. I think the thing is, particularly for anybody using those systems, there is a component of education. So what is it that the person has to do? What is it that's going to be happening while they're doing a particular process? What then happens with their data? You know, and so there is an element of technology where we kind of don't educate the user. And so I think about an example of my mother-in-law. She uses a bank in the UK, and they decided that they were going to roll out a facial recognition system. And so she came to me, and she's in her 70s. And so she came to me and she said, well, I don't want to use this facial recognition system. And I was, okay, well, why don't you want to use it? And she totally blew me away with her answer, because she doesn't know anything about facial recognition. She said, well, because I don't think it's secure. And I went, okay. And I was like, so why don't you think it's secure? And she was like, well, because I think iris recognition would be more secure. and so, you know, and so she was like, I don't want to use it. I don't have a problem with using biometrics, but I don't think that particular biometric is secure. And so I think it's interesting, because we put these new technologies in front of people without really explaining to them what we're doing. And we come from a organization to the user perspective, rather than let's have a look at the user and understand what they need and how we explain to them what's happening, and you know, execute things on the ground. And everybody everywhere is doing that not particularly well. You know, it's no, you know, I look at the UK. We don't do that well in the UK. We don't explain really to users what we're doing. So I think technology is great. We just have to spend a bit more time educating users as to what it is.
And it reminds me of my grandmother, who was asked at her bank the other day if she knew what her PIN number was. She said no. And then the whole thing got reset, and she needed to wait for this to be posted to her, so she couldn't use her account for a few days. And my mum said to her, but you do know your PIN number? And she was like, no. And mum was like, the 4-digit number you input. And she was like, oh yeah, I know that. And it's a language barrier as well. You know, she didn't know what PIN
is. Yeah.
You know, and so the communication thing is also about communicating in the most simplistic terms.
Exactly that. Yeah. I mean, we have a thing, you know, that the terminology OTP, one-time passcode, and people talk about OTPs, and I'm like, nobody outside of identity and security knows what an OTP is. OTPs, you know. So I think we just have to use more plain language.
Yeah. And for everybody, yeah, it wouldn't be a bad thing for everyone, you know, not just the grandmothers of the world, for all of us in the world. We all know what we'd be talking about a lot.
Plain language.
Yeah, sure. We have, I think there's a couple of other people that have raised their hands, but if they can type their question in the Q&A function, because we've only got a few minutes left, so going to people for questions would take us a little bit over time. But we've got another question that came in about, and it's a special group, I guess, another group that can easily be excluded is refugees.
Yeah.
What's, you know, are there any options or thoughts that you have around refugees as a group in terms of ID?
I mean, again, it's not an area that I'm going to profess to be, you know, massively kind of expert on. I think, again, one of the challenges that I have had with identity companies saying they're going to tackle the refugee issue is that the question I always ask them is, have you ever been to a refugee camp? And I can honestly say 99% of the time they say no. And so I think refugees, there are so many challenges that, you know, refugees have. And I think it has to be a very, very specific, you know, and it might be an identity that they need to be able to throw away, you know, in case of their situation changes, because their situation is evolving at a rate that we, you know, perhaps can't understand. But I think the most important thing, again, for me, is starting with the understanding of what the problems are, and can identity work in that instance, and can it be flexible enough to work with a situation where you've got, you know, perhaps refugees that are perhaps migrating and moving all the time, and moving from, you know, rapidly evolving situations, you know, sometimes in a really bad way, that doesn't end up being weaponized and can be used against them. And so, you know, that's I'm not going to profess to say, you know, this is what I think the solution is, because, you know, I think my concern has always been for technology providers, when they say we're going to go and fix this issue with identity and refugees, you know, often they've never been to a refugee camp and spoken to actual people that are in that situation. So I think it's always important to start with the user and the problem that you're trying to solve.
And we talk about that a lot, and so much when we're talking about designing digital finance products as well. You know, what is the point of you in you know, your relatively probably urbanized, relatively income stable life, designing products for grassroots people, you know, rural areas, farmers, maybe, you know, don't have a stable income. What you want and what they want are going to be, you know, potentially very, very different.
Yeah, exactly. And you just have to go and you have to talk to those people and understand what their needs are, you know, and build back from the problem into whatever solution, you know, whether that be technology or not technology, that you're looking to build.
I mean, all these things, AI, machine learning, blockchain, they're all really cool and amazing.
They are.
If we start there and not with the problem, then we're fixing things, or even, you know, making things worse. Then
well, we don't even know the problem that we're trying to fix it for. So, you know, I think that's the thing that I've heard with, you know, the whole refugee thing is, you know, blockchain's going to solve the refugee thing. And I'm like, okay, you know, has anyone ever been to a refugee camp? Do you understand the problem that you're trying to solve?
And you know, whether people want an ID, you know, for example, you know, if religious persecution or maybe, you know, sexuality or whatever, you know, are you wanting to admit some of those things to be on, you know?
Yeah, and so we always have to think about tools and weapons, and identity can be a tool and it can be a weapon. And within our community, in the identity community, we have a huge responsibility to build tools and think about how they can potentially be weaponized. You know, you know, it's something that I try to talk about all the time, is we have a huge responsibility, and it's incredibly important that we think about how our bias might affect that.
It's that worst case scenario, you know, you've got to, you know, think for that, because you know, trying that helps to try and avoid it happening by thinking about it before it happens, I suppose.
Exactly.
And I love that, you know, like, trying to put yourself in the shoes of, or, you know, if you can't go to a refugee camp, then maybe speak to an organization that works with refugees that could give you some of those insights that you might need to get things going, you know, trying to build that diversity. So if you don't have that diversity, if you don't have that knowledge, either go and get it, or try and surround yourself with people and partners that can provide different perspectives.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that.
Well, I've had a thoroughly enjoyable and eye-opening hour with you, Emma. I'm so appreciative of your time today and what you've shared with us, and how it, you know, the fact that it's not about being judgmental. We all have biases. We all we don't know what we don't know. You know, there are things that we just don't know, because we just don't know we don't know them. And there's no point being accusatory about them. Actually, it's just around trying to find ways to surround ourselves with people, with teams who will point those out to us, so that we can actually make the improvements either in ourselves or our products that we need, in order to minimize the negative impact that we have with the products and ideas that we have.
Cool, but thanks so much for the opportunity. It was great to have the chance to kind of talk to everybody, and yeah, thank you.
And we've had Natalie as well, who also says she wants to know more about the ambassador program. So right. Yeah, we might have one person at least. And Natalie's in Kenya, which I think very much needs an ambassador right now. Things that are happening there. So yeah, fingers crossed. We've had a very fruitful session for the last hour. I'll be the recording with everybody that's on the line today, and for anyone who signed up but were unable to come, and then we'll also put more widely out on our LinkedIn. And you're very welcome to share in your networks as well, so we can
very much
hearing about the work of women, you know, and what's also needs to happen in the identity sector as well. So thank you, Emma, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you at a webinar soon.
Thanks so much. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.